Howdy, of you delicious people. Wayne's World, party time, excellent. So, we are here to review Wayne's World. When watching this movie, I can just really watch this film and kind of remember just old Saturday Night Live. Like, to me, this kind of reminds me of when recently we would just have a lot of acts or whatever for Saturday Night Live just go so well that they deemed having there be like a movie done on them, where you'd have like Wayne's World, you'd have like the Coneheads, and like so on and so forth. There would just be these interesting acts that just went so far beyond uh, what they could deliver, and so ultimately they just delivered them a movie because they were doing so well. Kind of reminds me of like a Bill Hader or like a Kirsten Wig that ultimately would just become so undeniably like they're so undeniably good at what they do that they just like they need a bigger place to otherwise showcase their talent. And we have also so many times here within this movie. I think that this is very. There's a lot of funny things going on in this film that I really do enjoy. I think there's a lot of memorable things going on here. But I also think that they also do rest a lot on playing a lot of just straight up music during this movie. And so when looking at it, I'm like, well, there's a lot of funny things going on here, but reasonably, the the big thing to really pull away from is just that, like, okay, I'm interested in this film, but like, I want to see eventually where it goes further on from here, where reasonably it gets more interesting, and really where uh, you have to have characters like Wayne or ultimately Mike Myers, who ultimately consistently has to like look into the camera and goes like, "Hey," like, and like so much of that really brings to mind like so many people that would just kind of like completely forget about the fourth wall and ultimately just kind of smile to the camera. You would consistently have like uh the guy from The Office, who's the main character of The Office. His name is like John Krasinski, and ultimately he would just kind of just go like look into the camera, just be like 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 kind of waving at the camera. And so recently, every time that I'm kind of watching Wayne in this movie, it kind of just reminds me consistently of that guy from The Office. That ultimately would just ultimately be this person that would consistently just look in the camera, just like meh, like to the point where like I think that was like bizarrely that was just his thing. That's ultimately what he got remembered by, would just be that guy that was consistently looking at the camera and just like meh, like just kind of like that. And um and so reasonably like we just have to enjoy that kind of little small little touch of portion of film, because that is kind of like laced throughout this entire film. We either have Mike Myers kind of really looking at the film or looking at the camera and talking to people, or we have Garth, who is Dana Carvey, who is kind of uh, he is also talking to the camera, but talking to the camera in a different way, where he's kind of like that shy person and stuff like that, which I think is always fun. And we have it to ultimately at some point he is kind of telling the camera, "Hey, look over there," and the camera does, and then he runs away, which I think is really funny. Uh, but we have it to where this movie is more. It has to be more than just uh, both Wayne and Garth. We ultimately have to have like a villain in this movie because there always has to be a villain. It just can't be a movie that's just like, hey, look at our adventures and like, hey, isn't this fun? No, there has to there has to always be a villain in a movie, and it seems like we always come to have Rob Lowe bizarrely be a film in every single one of these movies. It seems that also we had like in the movie Tommy Boy, where ultimately the Chris Farley film, ultimately Rob Lowe is the villain in that. I'm like, what is wrong with Rob Lowe? Why does he keep getting villain roles in all of these movies? I don't mind it because he pulls it off really well. It because he just plays that smug like, hey, look at me, I'm good looking guy, and so like so that like counter sets, especially in this movie where you have like Mike and Garth who are just kind of like, dude, I'm gonna wear torn jeans and ultimately win the girl Cassandra over, and and Rob is gonna have to work twice as hard to win over Cassandra, because when looking at it, it's like Wayne doesn't have the easy connection to Cassandra that Rob has. So Rob has to work twice as hard to win Cassandra over. Basically, like throwing money at her, basically. But while that is going on, we also have eventually Benjamin and or Rob, who is conspiring to basically take full advantage of two ignorant people that seem to be doing really well on TV. That ultimately it seems like they are appealing to a young audience, and Rob is ultimately noticing that. Like I think now, like especially on YouTube, if you probably look at the Wayne and Garth equivalent, you would probably have to go to probably like Good Mythical Morning is probably what I would assess would be the more current like Wayne's World Esh like characters, even though when looking at it, it's like, well, like they're not playing guitars, they're not whatever. No, it's just they're bringing interesting stuff that ultimately the youth will like, and to ultimately have that be just kind of like a cattle prod for them, to have their show do so well and on YouTube as well as anywhere, to have them be like rewarded for being like a high tier YouTube personalities of sorts. But anyways, I thought this movie was just like, it's kind of like remembering a certain time period at sorts, but when also watching this, I think anybody can enjoy this movie a lot better than say maybe an Austin Powers. Like I feel like this movie, as well as even the second one, like it seems like this movie is trying to bridge the gap to try to appeal to everyone. Where I think maybe Austin Powers, like I think they were just like, oh well, you're just gonna keep on seeing this because like you liked the first one, and that's where they like incorporate characters where ultimately uh, are just so unique and one of a kind that ultimately it might just start going like, yeah, I don't like this movie because of this person. Man, I don't like this movie because of that person, and so on and so forth. And when looking at this movie, like it simply is like it doesn't want to offend anybody. It's just like, hey, let's have a fun time together and this and that. So I think that's what's fun about this movie is it's just a movie that you like can kind of just sit down and just enjoy. You don't have to like pick through it and ultimately just like kind of uh like you don't have to like have like a lot of uh you don't have to know the references of everything. You don't need to know. You don't need to understand a lot of things to watch this movie. And I think that's the. It's kind of like one of those where you can just take your brain out and just plop it off to the side. Is really what this movie provides for you to enjoy. So let's go into that double sweet double five otherwise time to go into spoilers. Let's go into that big old spoiler time. Spoiler time. Maybe it's probably about that time that eventually you would probably go into maybe saying, that it's probably about a time where which you should probably actually spoil a movie, because at the end of the day you should probably say that you should probably tell everybody what's going on in this movie because it's really interesting and or cool to you. Whew, spoiler time. So it's about that party time, spoiler time moment. So let's go into it. So we ultimately just kind of open up into this movie with them just kind of going out and journeying out onto a road trip of sorts, collecting some people, having a kind of after party moment where ultimately they just throw in some Queen and Bohemian Rhapsody, and they just ultimately just kind of just bang it out, just kind of like head bang it out, and ultimately there's an interesting moment where like this movie becomes like really iconic with something as simple as people are just singing over the song or otherwise mouthing the song while just being in a car, a thing that probably anybody in the world would do, but ultimately when looking at it, um, that's what opens up with. It opens up with familiarity. Familiarity, if that's even a word, if I'm saying it correctly. A place of being familiar. That everyone would just go in their car and just belt out some tunes, especially if you've had a hard day or ultimately if you've had a party and you're just kind of wasted or drunk or whatever. So ultimately you just pop in some Queen and sing it out till your lungs fall out. So I think the most interesting part of this movie, from what I remember, is when they would go to a drive-in and ultimately they would just be like, and then ultimately, uh, we have it to where eventually the person like says back every single thing that they ordered on the menu, and and says it correctly, and is like, oh yeah, I guess that's what we all ordered. So I think that that moment's hilarious, but I think the most hilarious moment is probably the sponsorship moment that feels blatantly obvious. But I love the blatantly obvious sponsor moment. I think that that's the most hilarious. So we have a tour on here that these guys are doing their show, their Wayne's World show, and it seems that ultimately, while Rob Lowe is in a bedroom with a woman, with a lady, ultimately to just be like, yeah, like this woman is dumb, probably, or written to be dumb, and to ultimately, uh, Rob is just flipping through all the channels because he has nothing better to his life than ultimately just be flipping through channels because he's a millionaire, I guess, in this movie. And so while late at night we have Wayne's World going on the telly, and we ultimately have it to where Rob is watching the show and seeing how like obscure that these two guys are, and we have it to where this girl in Rob's bed is ultimately saying, "Oh, these guys are funny," and to where Rob is immediately just like I need to find out who these people are. Like, yeah, I guess like simplicity at its best. We ultimately have it to where Rob is going to Noah Arcade, and ultimately pitching to sponsor a show that ultimately he doesn't own, which is ultimately the Wayne's World show. I guess, funny enough, we have it to where ultimately like here's the con artist thing of Rob basically mentioning that like Rob desperately wants what he wants, so ultimately he's going to come to some other person, lie to their face, and uh, ultimately get them to easily do what he wants, because ultimately we have it to where this other person is just a ignorant person or doesn't know any better, or I don't know, he's just easily like he can just say these magic words to just persuade this person over, or really it's just because it's written that way in the movie. So we ultimately have it to where Wayne eventually, or Rob eventually gets this sponsorship from Noah Arcade to eventually have some leverage to go to uh, Wayne's World to ultimately find them and find out where they live, and ultimately offer them, hey guys, like we're going to give you $5,000 and we're going to give you a sponsorship on your show to be able to do your show. To where easily we have it to where Garth and Wayne are just like, oh my god, he's going to give us money to do this show? All right. Because I don't think they were ever getting money to do this show before, but I guess now they're getting money, so they think that they're big shots. Um, So ultimately, we have it to where it seems that Wayne and Garth eventually meet their sponsor and don't like him at all. And ultimately, a lot of the questions that ultimately is to be asked is uh, to ultimately just reflect on how like ignorant that Noah eventually is, sadly enough. But again, it's all written that way. So we have it to where Wayne and Garth are living large by just going into a diner that they seemingly frequent, where it seems that we have the guy who is ultimately from Married with Children, who ultimately I'm trying to find what the actual character's name is. Where is it? Where? Where? Oh, where? Where could it be ultimately? Uh, Oh my god. I'm trying to find it. I'm trying to find it. I don't know what his actual. Anyway, Mitaka's manager Glenn. Mitaka's manager Glenn. Ed O'Neill. Yeah, Married with Children. So Glenn, ultimately, funny enough, we have it to where ultimately Glenn just starts talking to the camera as well, kind of mentioning his stories and stuff like that. And we ultimately have it to where Wayne takes offense to that because he's like, hey, you know I'm the only person that's supposed to be talking to the camera. So we ultimately have it uh, to where also Garth also talks into the camera as well, but then we ultimately have it to where he either like he's very shy and ultimately has the camera kind of look away to while he runs off, and he has these very shy moments. But it seems like he also has this girl that he's after that ultimately he is going to at some point try to seduce in his own mind. Because I guess he can't actually try to actually seduce this girl himself. So we ultimately push on into this movie because we have to keep just pushing on and eventually have these guys otherwise land themselves to be able to go into clubs and stuff like that. And ultimately, eventually, Wayne ends up meeting or seeing this girl named Cassandra, and she just loves how she sings and loves her band and everything like that. And ultimately, whenever he is hearing her, like it seems like there is some bizarre effect that goes around her whenever she's singing, and I just think it's like really interesting. How he's just like, how he's just kind of like in awe of her. So eventually, we end up having it to where, uh, in this movie, I'm pushing a lot of stuff going on in this movie, just kind of quickly running through a lot of things. So we have it to where eventually the best parts are eventually when uh, to where when instead of doing what they were doing in their own home and getting paid for it, no. Bizarrely, they have to change into having this be some kind of like actual studio place of so it's basically they're still in that same house in the background, but when looking at it they're like they have like a much more legitimate like additions and stuff like that going on into this, so it makes it look way much bigger and stuff like that. And I was like, God, what a huge obscurity to just go like, okay, well, here's an actual home, but no, like we're gonna do a set piece instead. And after that, we have it to where ultimately we have to have a big giant logo that now has to like say like Noah's Arcade presents Wayne's World, and then also we have to uh, when Wayne and Garth first do their first real legitimate TV show, they absurdly have their theme song changed to where ultimately they have like a artist of someone ultimately doing it to where ultimately you have Wayne and Garth that are just very confused of like, okay, what's going on? You gotta love the moment though where ultimately you have names escape me. Russell that is ultimately trying to help them figure out how to count down to ultimately then go live. To ultimately you have them have to practice this out where there's 5, 4, 3, and then they have to like practice it. And like hilariously enough, when you have the cameraman that is ultimately just going like 5, 4, 3, 2, and ultimately you have the entire time where Wayne and Garth are ultimately trying to like go and like every single time you have to Russell's ultimately going yeah, I see you nod. I'm seeing you nod, guys. You can't nod. And ultimately they're counting down as well, and like it's just ridiculous. So because eventually one of the scenes is ultimately to have a green screen or a blue screen that ultimately I really just would rather say green screen, but it is what it is. They have a blue screen where ultimately they have like all these weird environments that I guess that they just have to make a joke about wherever they've ever been to. And I'm like, okay, was that one of those where they just kind of like wung this whole like wung, whatever. This whole like, hey, how about we just try this? Because ultimately, this we have more budget than we did before to do this movie. So how about we do this now? Now that we hadn't done that before. Um, I really thought and enjoyed the fact that eventually once they finally get this sponsor and they have him interviewed, how the questions of all the stuff that Wayne had to ask Noah was just like the simplest arcade questions of like, hey, like what's the difference between Mr. Pac-Man and Miss Pac-Man? I'm like, oh, it's just a bow. Oh. And the entire time we have it to where Wayne is ultimately humiliating Noah by having like crappy things that he's mentioning about him, that like this guy has no dick, and I have proof, and ultimately kind of demeaning this guy like really like horribly and just making jokes of him. But then afterwards we have it to where it seems that Noah is like happy with everything, and we ultimately have it to where Wayne and Garth go off, and ultimately we have it to where Rob is asking about the cards in the back, and Russell's like, "Hey, those cards weren't written like that when I gave that to him." So we ultimately have it to where Rob is mentioning it's like, well, hey, you know what, guys, I understand that you guys might not like sponsors and stuff like that, and like the whole time we have it to where ultimately they have a sponsor spot going on where Wayne is like grabbing a thing of pizza and he's like and then eating it, and then he's ultimately talking about like, yeah, all this sponsor talk is giving me such a headache. If only I could find a way to ultimately relieve this. And then ultimately you have Garth giving Wayne Tylenol, and he's like, "Ah, I feel so much better now." And to where ultimately, uh, Rob is like consistently talking and mentioning about like, well, like it's technically your choice, and ultimately Wayne's like, yeah, a choice of a new generation, as he has a Pepsi in frame, and and then we ultimately eventually have it to where ultimately Garth is talking about like, yeah, I feel so bad when when you get those celebrities that just have to really just really push all their sponsorship, and man, it's so ridiculous, as he's wearing like head to toe like Reebok, and, and it just looks hilarious. So we have it to her ultimately, and I'm wondering if the people that like sponsored that kind of like realized that they would kind of do an obvious sponsorship like that, or and maybe they were okay with it because F it, it's in Wayne's World. So pushing on, it seems that eventually we find out that it seems that Wayne is trying to win Cassandra over to the point of even learning the language of which Cassandra is supposedly uh, to have also spoken at some point. Let's just say. Um, it's kind of interesting where after a gig, Wayne tries to like get him and Cassandra kind of away and like start to like talk in a foreign language. But then we find out that like they just stop talking and the subtitles just keep on going, I guess, to really just say it's like, yeah, that's all that we wanted to learn to speak. And then after that, it's like, man, whatever. Like, just keep on doing the subtitles, which I thought was hilarious. So, but then eventually we have in a later part of the movie where ultimately Rob eventually speaks what uh, like I think it's like Cantonese or something as well to Cassandra, because ultimately she knows exactly what kind of dialect and whatever she's from, because Rob knows every single language, which is the language of bullshit. So we push on. So we have a tour eventually. The funny thing about the ending of this movie is that they have to go through multiple endings. Like they even have to even do the Scooby Doo ending, which ultimately makes no sense. Uh, but reasonably, we have it to where eventually within this movie, it's really just to have Wayne help out Cassandra, help get her career off, to where ultimately they try and do an episode with her, uh, showcasing her music, to ultimately hope that someone is going to uh, give money to her, spend money to her, and this and that. Um, and so, because reasonably, what ends up happening is that Rob is ultimately trying to steal Cassandra away, and ultimately, we eventually have it to where Wayne is starting to see Cassandra slipping through his fingertips by Rob just kind of ultimately giving her own music video, and ultimately giving her these la da set pieces, and ultimately just uh, really just trying to win her over consistently, to where eventually Wayne goes on to this video set and ultimately is mentioning how Rob is trying to manipulate Cassandra, and basically how Rob's character is going through elaborate ways to try to make Cassandra happy, but it's not all really real. Like he eventually like, yeah, I bet there's no film in this camera, as he pulls out all the film in the camera, and the camera film is just continuously repetitiously going and going and going and going. And because eventually, like, Wayne is just like, yeah, these are just romantic gestures that he's trying to win you over with, and they're all lies, but which they are, like, the only lie is really that just Rob is ultimately having a chance to really win Cassandra over, really and truly. So while ultimately Wayne and Garth are ultimately at a concert with supposedly this guy, Mr. Big, which they find out some information about him that comes way too convenient, that ultimately is going to help them with the plot of this movie, and they ultimately have to mention it's like, yeah, like that security guard, which is ultimately played by Chris Farley. Yeah, he gave us a lot of information that ultimately will probably be easy for us to understand later on in the movie, huh? Like kind of winking at that. So we ultimately have it to where instead of having Cassandra try to do this video, which ultimately it seemed that this snake was just kind of either falling asleep or just kind of like she was trying to like juggle it while trying to play a guitar and sing at the same time, which ultimately looks hilarious. Uh, we have it eventually to where uh, now we are led to have Cassandra just do a spot on Wayne's World, ultimately hoping that there is going to be some Mr. Big out there that ultimately is going to go to this location and help Cassandra out by giving her a singing deal or a record deal. So we ultimately go along within this movie, and we have them sing the song of which, and ultimately leads them to eventually going into different kind of endings for this movie. Because ultimately, yeah, I think there might be some stuff here and there that ultimately happened in this movie, but really, yeah, it's like it's a really funny movie. I really enjoy it, but I think there is some big spots that ultimately get remembered in this movie. But everything else is just kind of like, okay, they go to a concert with Alice Cooper, and Alice Cooper sings "Feed My Frankenstein," which I love that song. It's a great song. Um, Ultimately, they end up having seemingly more and more losing the ability of ultimately feeling that they're not being controlled by Rob, and ultimately Wayne and Garth are ultimately just kind of just like, well, I don't want to be employed by the man kind of thing, and so ultimately they just decide to just do stuff on their own. Because ultimately we have it to where Rob is really just trying to take advantage of these people, and it comes blatantly obvious that there is a mention that ultimately Wayne and Garth are going to be swindled by Rob. It kind of comes blatantly obvious that even they're basically telling you the plot of this movie in the movie, but so eventually we have it to where ultimately they try to do this Scooby Doo ending where it seems that everything seems to go well for Cassandra, and ultimately Rob Lowe eventually gets arrested, and we have it to where ultimately Wayne is mentioning that, like, well, let's try to see who the real Benjamin Oliver is, and then they ultimately unmask him, and it's some old man, and it's like, oh my god, whoa! But then they're like, no, let's do like I think they end up doing like two other endings, and one of the other endings is that Mr. Big comes and gives them the big contract, and it's like, oh well, hey, this is great, this is the greatest ending. But then ultimately they go and do like a morality ending where they find out like everybody has this like morality speech that they have to have, where you have like this one guy who is, I think it's Terry, yeah, Terry, who just tells everybody, I love you, man, I love you, and ultimately they're just like, yeah, okay, sure. And ultimately, like, Terry's like, no, I don't think you get it. And we have it to where, like, Garth is just telling Russell at some point when they're driving off, it's like, just tell him you love him, man. Like, just, yeah, just like, or otherwise this is gonna end awkward. And so, like, towards the end of the movie, we have to eventually, like they have to have this whole morality thing where they have, like, Russell mentioning, like, yes, like, me and this man are both lovers, and that is completely okay. And, like, and then everybody has their thing where ultimately, at some point, Garth eventually gets his lover girl, by, I guess, sweeping her off her feet by playing the song Roxy or Foxy. Blam, 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 Foxy. And that's a hilarious scene. We ultimately have to eventually, Garth had so much money that he had the ability to be able to afford the guitar that he's always ever wanted, because he's like, oh, the Stradivarius guitarish whatever thing. Ultimately, it's in a sealed case. Ultimately, so no one can touch it. It's the Excalibur of guitars. Ultimately, for him to buy it, and because we have it to where, bizarrely, Wayne has to mention that there is a "Can I help you" tune that he has to play on a guitar. So he, like, just starts playing this thing on the guitar, and the customer service guy ultimately says, "Can I help you?" So we ultimately have it to where, Wayne gets this very expensive guitar, and ultimately that's just to, like, show that it's like, hey, this show has money, or hey, like Wayne is making so much money now, and so good for him. But it ultimately we have to where ultimately Wayne is paying in cash. So, but yeah, like, other than that real opening scene where we have it to where they are in the car and they are singing Queen, and ultimately, there's some, like, transitional moments where we have some interesting banter between some of the side characters, or just, like, a lot of points where there are, just some kind of goofy little points, that ultimately eventually land at some point, to be funny. Yeah, that's all I have to really much say about this movie. We're at the end where they have, like, the morality thing, where ultimately they're just like, oh, well, I'm okay with the life that I lead, and oh, I'm okay with the life that I lead, and blah blah blah. And ultimately you have Garth that is ultimately with his lover woman, his fantasy woman, I guess, his dream woman, and so, like, everybody's turning out okay. Like, there's one interesting moment where, also Wayne and Garth are ultimately, sitting on top of their car, and they consistently have to have a plane go by them. Like, the first time is for them to not freak out while it happens, and then the second time we have it to where, uh, it seems that, Wayne and Garth are having this argument, and we have it to where Garth is ultimately saying, "Well, you're a big," as the plane is flying by, and Garth is still going, and Wayne is just like, "Uh huh, uh huh." It's such a silly scene, but, like, and you just have, like, of course, Garth is just going, and you're a stupid person, as the plane is done going by, and ultimately it's like, wow, you said a lot of hurtful things there, kind of, like, just like the goofiest things going on in this movie. But at the end of the day, I thought it to just be really, really. I thought it to be really fun at the end of the day. So, anyways, I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.